So I'd like to begin today's presentation with a quote from the chairman's foreword of the World Commission on Environment and Development report titled Our Common Future, that was presented to the UN General Assembly in 1987. Quote, when the terms of reference of our commission were originally being discussed in 1982, there were those who wanted its consideration to be limited to environmental issues only. This would have been a grave mistake. The environment does not exist as a separate sphere from human actions, ambitions, and needs, and attempts to defend it in isolation from human concerns have given the very word environment a connotation of naivety in some political circles. The word development has also been narrowed by some into very limited focus, along the lines of what poor nations should do to become richer. And thus again is automatically dismissed by many in the international arena as being a concern of specialists, of those involved in questions of development assistance. But the environment is where we all live, and development is what we all do in attempting to improve our lot within that abode, end quote. As this quote makes clear, the primary concern of sustainability was economic growth within the Earth ecosystem, which is considered finite. And yet, upon closer examination, the questions such as what is to be sustained cannot be answered in any straightforward way. For example, is it the level of production and consumption that needs to be sustained? For what and whom? And how are needs understood and measured? Insofar that certain people's needs are defined in ways that exclude the more than humans meet theirs. For example, I'm thinking here of the global south has been sites where the north dump its toxic waste and extract the raw materials for its own needs. Global inequalities will be maintained and exacerbated by the abstract notion of our common future. Despite, or perhaps because of this vagueness, the word sustainability is attached to many things. And I just did a quick search on Financial Times and all these words popped up. So for example, sustainable governance, sustainable finance, sustainable clothing, sustainable palm oil, sustainable coffee, sustainable leader, sustainable business, sustainable capitalism. It is as if sustainability is a quality that can be simply added or deleted. These are the top Google search results of images of sustainability, as you can see in the screenshot. The most prominent features include the color green and blue, as Christine also mentioned. It also shows lots of spheres, light bulbs, and hands. These images visualize the imaginaries of sustainability discourse, namely harmonious coexistence, purity, innovation, and human agency. A close engagement with these images is beyond the scope of my presentation today. However, I'd like to highlight the logic of and the structure that structures the discourse of sustainability. Next slide, please. While it is commonly considered that humans are dependent upon and have an impact on nature, it seems to me that the relation between human and nature continues to be informed by the logic of and is manifested in various ways. For example, it is expressed in the agential capacity attributed to the rational human subject who chooses a certain action on passive nature. As a recent article in the Sustainable Transition Studies asserts, quote, we define agency as the human capability to make free choices and have an impact on one's environment, end quote. It's also expressed in certain narratives that aim to destabilize the superiority of humanness by emphasizing the ways in which they are inconsequential. For example, in an attempt to shift away from anthropocentrism, Ruska et al. Write, quote, humans are not superior to the rest of nature, but are a species among others. Nature exists regardless of humans. Nature is not dependent on humans, although humans are dependent on nature, end quote. In other words, the human species is seen as part of a whole. These assertions raise a number of issues. For example, how is the line drawn between nature and human? Where and when? Second, it seems to me that the seemingly oppositional assertion of human as either significant or inconsequential is informed by the assumption of nature that is located before, beyond, and outside human. So as you see, even in the part and whole configuration, human remains a self-contained unit that can be simply present or absent. As it was shown by analyzing the ad campaign Hairy Nose, which depicts the apocalyptic China, the logic of end is materialized along deeply racialized and gendered lines. I'd like you to consider the following questions as you watch the video. The first question is, what is sustained in the apocalyptic future? The second question is, where are nature and human located? Can you please show the video? Thank you.
瞧，这就是雾霾纪元的胜利场了。他们适应如此成功，甚至已经爱上了这个世界。对他们说，一切都是理所当然的。是乌烟瘴气的生活，还是没完没了的雾霾？不过，我倒是宁可被淘汰，因为是痛苦的呼吸，而非麻木的适应，提醒着我，天空曾经这么蓝过。你不改变雾霾，不改变。
What is the most effective way of filtering pollutants in air? Wear a mask, using an air purifier, eating certain supposedly non-cleansing foods such as pears and carrots? Or perhaps in order to survive, the body will evolve and transform itself by growing out very long and thick nose hair. The ad campaign Hairy Nose, published in 2016 for the Wild AIDS Go Blue program in China, presents imaginaries of the evolved bodies that have grown out very long nose hair. These are the bodies of people of smog that are said to have adapted to the polluted air in the apocalypse. Darwin once said we must adapt to survive. Look, here they are, the victors of the pollution age, says the protagonist. From whose lens we encounter the gray apocalyptic China, where everyone has long and thick nose hair styled in different shapes and colors. Interestingly, from the start of the ad campaign, we get a sense that there is something wrong with the protagonist. For example, he's laughed at by the pupils at what looks like a prestigious school. When passing by a couple walking with a baby in a stroller, the baby confusedly stares at him. When he gets on the tram, other passengers either move away to avoid him or look at him in despise or take photos of him. A dog also with sprouting nose hair barks at him as if chasing him away. Neither is he welcome at a fancy social club, where he receives not only dismissive glances but also hostile behavior from his friends who shoot billiard balls at him. So why is he perceived as the other, who appears to be strange, different, and less than? The reason is revealed to the audience at the end of the ad campaign. We encounter, through the protagonist's lens, his girlfriend at a restaurant. We see a carefully wrapped gift that the protagonist gives to his girlfriend. She takes a quick glance at it from the corner of her eyes and pushes it away with her nose hair. The next scene takes place in the bathroom. The protagonist opens the package and reveals that the gift is actually 2 matching razors. He picks up one razor and says, "Me, I'd rather be eliminated." As the protagonist looks into the mirror to trim his nose hair that just begins to sprout from his nose, we see his face for the first time, a bright-looking young man. In the next scene, the protagonist looks out from his window at the grey cityscape. Behind him, on one side of the wall, are pictures of the city under the blue sky, opposite to which is a TV screen that is displaying an ad of a hair care product where a model is showing her shiny nose hair. We hear the protagonist explaining why he chooses to trim his nose hair. This is because it's the painful breathing and not the numbing adaptation that reminds me the sky used to be blue. At the end of the ad campaign, the message, "Change air pollution before it changes you," is displayed at the middle of the screen against the backdrop of the blue sky, under which a city is surrounded by mountains, a harmonious coexistence of nature and society. This ad campaign slogan echoes the discourse of War on Smog in China, a war declared by the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang at the opening of China's National People's Congress on 5th March 2014. Central to the anti-pollution policy are a set of measures aiming to decrease the coal dependence of the economy through development of, for example, low-carbon technologies and low-waste systems. These policies are embedded in China's framework of ecological civilization, which was made part of the official policy in 2012 at the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. The importance of improved air quality and environmental sustainability is indisputable. While air pollution is still a sensitive topic in China, and I'm thinking here, for example, the documentary Under the Dome, in which the journalist Chai Jin investigated the problem of air pollution, was quickly censored in China just 3 days after its release at the beginning of 2015. Public protestations against air pollution have actually pushed the government to make concrete changes. Nevertheless, the management of air pollution is posited as mainly a technological issue and an individual responsibility, and sideline the ways in which the imaginaries of the relation between polluted air and the individual, the social, and the national body are informed by the sense of purity and exceptional status of the human. For the most part, my argument here is in line with critical scholarly work that calls into question the illusion of purity, which typically centers on the figure of the bounded body that is in need of protection from outside pollutants. Such a configuration informs the individualized purity politics that locates the responsibility for managing health primarily in the individual, and elides the political and economic structure that produce and unevenly distributes pollution. As Alexis Shotwell writes, quote, "People who live at the site of multiple vectors of vulnerability have less possibility for individually managing their health to resist the structural context that produces premature group-differentiated death," end quote. In contrast to the logic of purity that produces whiteness as a social location, and this is a quote from Shotwell, Shotwell advocates political and ethical practices of quote and end quote against purity. Being against purity means, according to Shotwell, quote, that there is no primordial state we might wish to get back to, no Eden we have desecrated, no pre-toxic body we might uncover, end quote. Rather, it necessitates a radical responsibility that foregrounds the heterogeneous co-constitution of the human and more than human bodies. And yet, as Shotwell explicitly states, to argue that we have never been pure does not mean that we should be for, quote, pollution, harm, sickness, or premature death. It's to be against the rhetoric or conceptual attempt to delineate and delimit the world into something separable, disentangled, and homogeneous, end quote. Interestingly, the question which needs to be asked is in what way air pollution does not answer the demand for contamination. That can be found in, for example, Donna Haraway's theorization of the vampire, who embodies radical contagion, polluting and eroding the illusion of purity in one bite. It seems to me that two different and separate forms of impurity are at work here. One is the dynamic relationality and more than human entanglements that express the flourishing of life. The other is the contamination and pollution that threatens life. Central to this distinction installed between these two forms of impurity is an implicit investment in the notion of life that is, ironically, pure. If to be against purity is to be against the metaphysical individualism and the logic of boundedness that also informs the logic of end, then the assumed difference between purity and impurity and the opposition between life and death it informs also needs to be called into question. In that campaign, the protagonist was seen as the other of the society. This is not simply because his trim nose hair makes him appear different and in fact unfit, given that bodies with long nose hair are said to be the result of evolution and adaptation. But the cutting of the nose hair also means that the body loses the capacity to filter the pollutants in the air. Breathing without the long and thick nose hair may not only be painful, as the protagonist states at the end of the ad campaign, but is possibly suicidal in the imagined air apocalypse. In the subway, we see the other passengers moved away from him. As Sarah Ahmed reminds us, the affective process is often felt as a relation of proximity and distance between bodies. The protagonist's body or lack of nose hair is perceived as lacking, disgusting, fearful, as if the received incapacity of filtering air because of the lack of visible nose hair also renders the body itself contagious and as a source of pollution. Next slide, please. So where does the body end and polluted air begin? In fact, imaginaries of growing nose hair as the evolved feature of the Chinese body already began to circulate on Chinese social media before the release of the ad campaign. As the following entries from Xinnan Weibo, which is one of the most popular social media platforms in China, makes clear, I translated all of them and also slightly modified for the sake of not viewing the identities of who wrote what. So in the first entry, the Weibo user says, why haven't we changed our beauty standards so that we could find nose hair beautiful? Trimmed nose hair is obviously not useful for breathing the polluted air. Why don't we find trimmed nose hair pretty? And in the second entry, the user says, it has been so smoggy and gray since November. Have the scientists studied whether nose hair of the Chinese people is the thickest and longest in the world? And the last entry reads, to adapt to the exacerbated air pollution, our body can produce more nose hair to defend us against the smog. The excessive nose hair is considered to be a manifestation of the unattended, disordered, and impure nature, which also testifies to the missing human subject who is supposed to manage and organize nature. As we have seen at the end of the ad campaign, the protagonist explains why he prefers to trim his nose hair even at the expense of his life. And he says, this is because it's the painful breathing and not the numbing adaptation that reminds me that the sky used to be blue. It follows that although growing nose hair sustains the life of the body, it changes what counts as properly human, characterized by the contained and managed bodily boundary and the controlling capacity of the human subject. The people of smog may be physically alive, but their numbness towards the pressing issues of environmental degradation and its impact on the human body also suggests the death of their humanness. In other words, the people of smog are more and less than human. As Kay Anderson writes, quote, humanness has been presumed to entail a transcendence of nature conceived of as, first, a non-human sphere of animals and environment that is external to people, and second, corporeal nature that is thought of as animal-like within human beings, end quote. On this account, humanness emerges by cultivating upon, taming and domesticating and transforming the external and internal nature. In the ad campaign, the protagonist represents his exceptional human status insofar as he, unlike everyone else, chooses to trim nose hair. The trimming of nose hair expresses his humanness from the following aspects. First, it tempts the internal animality manifested in excess of nose hair, an excess that mirrors the hypervisibility of polluted air. Second, the boundary of the individual body is managed and secured by using a safety razor, which is a modern technology for efficiently maintaining personal hygiene. As Rebecca Herzig writes in her study on the history of hair removal in the US context, in the early 20th century, the invention of the safety razor facilitated the privatization of cleaning and maintenance of the body. Moreover, due to its efficiency, the safety razor was also adopted by the US Army in the First World War. As Herzig explains, quote, "Shaving appeared advantageous to military leaders for several reasons. Not only did beard removal help to keep down lice and other vermin, but it also helped assure a close fit for the gas masks used in the trenches. By the time the American soldiers joined the conflict in Europe, US Army regulations required every soldier to possess a shaving device of some kind," end quote. At the core of the imaginaries of people of smog, as well as the discourse of war on pollution and the ecological civilization, is a separation between nature and human, and relatedly between the flesh of the body that simply survives and the intelligent, moral, and reflexive subject who is capable of political actions and moral reflexivity. Trimming nose hair is depicted as a heroic and civilized act of the protagonist, as it signifies a will to take control of, through separating from, nature. This gesture is said to demonstrate an ecological awareness that differentiates the humanness of the protagonist from the numbness of the people of smog. On this account, nature, which is manifest in the nose hair and the polluted air, is not considered as a pure and self-enclosed entity that only gets supplemented by technologies. For if nature and humanness operate according to two radically different orders, such as the fitness within nature, represented by excessive nose hair, and the fitness within humanity, expressed by the decision to trim the nose hair, as depicted in the ad campaign, what bridges the gap between the two separate realms so that the former can transform the latter and vice versa? Next slide, please. In her book chapter titled Earth, Love It or Live It, Kelly Oliver depicts the imaginary of Earth as an island, as she writes, quote, "An island is always in between land and sea, between safe harbor and threatening isolation. Like everything abject, an island both fascinates and terrifies. It fuels our ambivalent, even contradictory desire to love and leave, to stay and to flee. Images of Earth as an island, beautiful and blue, floating alone in the darkness of space, are both threatening and reassuring," end quote. Oliver suggests that the discourse of saving the Earth is actually about saving ourselves, which often assumes that we can master both ourselves and the Earth. This understanding of the exceptional status of the human condition also underpins the figure of island, the idea that humans are the arbiter and savior of nature, as well as the recognition of our insignificance in the universe. In view of this, Oliver suggests that the impossibility of simply love or leave the Earth or the human condition necessitates a new form of ethics and politics that is not grounded on an isolated island, but in the in-between space, the meeting of land and sea, of diverse cohabitation and dynamic interrelationality. I agree with Oliver's reading, but I also wish to suggest a simultaneous impossibility and necessity of loving it and living it. Next slide, please. The ACT campaign presents two futures, either fighting for a home and our bodies or giving up and giving into the impure and disordered environment that ultimately change who we are. The nose hair becomes the location these alternative futures are played out. Love the nose hair or leave it along with the body that it is part of. In suggesting loving it and living it, I'm hoping to underscore the dynamic, destructive, and productive negotiations through which humanness emerges in, through, with, and as nature. Instead of simply suggesting that nature presents the limit of growth, or that humans are either significant or inconsequential, I wish to end the presentation by asking whether we could entertain the possibility of, to paraphrase Vicky Kirby, accepting, rejecting, and radically reconfiguring the human condition and its ability to sustain. Thank you.